in a long time.
Welcome. I want to welcome everyone who's joining us today for our fourth discussion in a series of 6 on different topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. My name is Jamie Hollis. My pronouns are she and her. And I've had the privilege of working with the Rotary Group and being a facilitator for these conversations today and for this series. I'm excited tonight that our topic is focused now on the LGBTQ community and ways that we can build supportive organizations, processes, and welcoming communities. And so again, am really excited for the conversation tonight. We have some great speakers that are going to be giving us some tips and advice for how we can make daily small changes in our life to build those inclusive networks. And so first, I'd like to introduce Rob Gelder. He'll be the Rotarian that will be leading our discussion tonight. Rob was born and raised in upstate New York and has called the Pacific Northwest home for about 30 years. He's been a member of the Poulsbo Rotary Club for 17 years and currently serves as a Kitsap County Commissioner for District 1. Rob received his degree in political science from the University of Rochester. And a lesser known fact, Rob studied the Norwegian language at the University of Oslo in 1988. Rob and his partner call the Keyport community home. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you.
And our special guest tonight, really excited to have Manny with us. Manny Santiago is our special guest tonight. He was born and raised in a coffee farm in Puerto Rico and has been involved in social justice work from a very young age. Before his appointment by Governor Inslee as the inaugural executive director for the Washington State LGBTQ Commission, Manny served as the executive director of Rainbow Center, which is a Tacoma-Pierce County LGBTQ community center. He received his undergraduate degree in sociology from the University of Puerto Rico in the Mayagüez
Yes.
practice campus and studied public administration at the Pontifical Catholic University of Puerto Rico and has a master's in divinity, which is a theology degree from Andover Newton Theological School in Massachusetts. In 2007, Manny became the first openly queer Latino to be ordained a minister in the American Baptist churches in the U.S. Since then, he has served progressive congregations in Boston, New York City, and Seattle. While in Washington, he was part of the marriage equality campaign and was frequently invited to speak at public hearings and at the state legislature. In 2011, the Huffington Post listed Manny as one of the most inspiring LGBTQ religious leaders in the United States. Manny is frequently invited to speak and lead workshops on issues of social activism, progressive faith, LGBTQ rights, Latinx rights, and their intersectionality. He served on the Religious Advisory Council for the Human Rights Campaign and has been involved with the sanctuary movement in the United States. He currently gives back to his community through service on the Multicultural Advisory Committee for Tacoma Community College and is advisor to the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network and is a member of the board of Tacoma Community House, the Tacoma Art Museum, and Waves Ahead, which is an LGBTQ center in Puerto Rico. He's also a mentor with the Jane's Leadership Fellowship of the Russell Family Foundation in Gig Harbor. At the international level, he's been invited to lead workshops and speak on LGBTQ rights by organizations and governments in Cuba, Honduras, Panama, Mexico, El Salvador, and Canada. His writings have been featured by the Huffington Post, the Washington Post, and several theological journals and books. Manny currently lives on the ancient lands of the Puyallup people in Tacoma, with his husband, Fernelli Hernandez, a member of the Yucatec Mayan people of southern Mexico. In his free time, which I'm not convinced he has, after reading this, in his free time, Manny, he enjoys traveling, cooking, hiking, and reading works by Latin American women writers. So again, Manny, we're so excited to have you here tonight and for the great conversation ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And by the way, I do take time off and I do rest and I I'm able to balance all that. When you have passion for something, you can do as much as you can and take time for your own self. So
Exactly. It's all about that work-life balance, and passions are passions, and I am definitely honored to have you today as our guest. And definitely on behalf of the Poulsbo Rotary Club, thank you very much. I want to do that. So Manny, really, I think it'd probably be a good place to start and maybe get out of the way, understanding what the LGBTQ Commission is for Washington State. Since you are the inaugural executive director, what is it and what is it not? And what is it not?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Rob. This is the first question that we get all the time because we are a new commission. We are a new agency of the state. So oftentimes people don't quite understand what it is that the commission is doing or what the other commissions do. In general, I can say that commissions in Washington right now, the agencies that form the small agency cabinet for the governor, we are what I call consulting agencies, right? And in that sense, what our main responsibility is to gather the feedback from our community so we can inform both the legislature and the governor on the decisions that they make on behalf of our community. So I do have and I can share with you the mission and the vision of the commission that kind of explains more succinctly what the commission is and what it is that we do. Thank you so much. So the Washington LGBTQ Commission, our mission is to improve the state's interface with the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, two-spirit, and intersex communities in Washington, to identify their needs and to ensure that there is an effective means of advocating for LGBTQ equity in all aspects of state government. So in that sense, what we do is, as I said, to gather information on what the needs are and then inform the legislature and the governor and the governor's office on how to address those needs. So kind of a policy advising agency. And then we do envision a state where every person, every two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, and intersex Washingtonian of any age feels safe, supported, and empowered. Thank you for the slide. But yeah, so that's what we do. We inform the agencies that work on policy and law on the issues that affect our community and how to best address them.
That's great. So the legislature in that case or the legislative staff would reach out to your your commission to actually kind of say, we're looking at this type of legislation or moving this forward. How would it impact the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, and not only that, yes, and in addition to that, community agencies and folk, LGBTQ folk in Washington can directly reach out to the commission if there's an issue that they see in their communities. We want to be intentional in addressing the needs of all Washingtonians who identify as LGBTQ and their allies. So, so it's not just the legislators bringing issues to us or because they already saw something, their constituents share with them some concerns and they want to address that. So it's not only that, it's also community grassroots organizations coming to us and say, my community is experiencing this. How can we work with you and with the different, with the different pieces in the government to address that? And it's very important to remember that when you live in a democracy, it is our responsibility as citizens to be engaged in those processes. So please make sure that you understand this and that you hear from me, an appointed person in government. You are part of this government. You are part of these processes. So we want to hear from you directly. What is affecting your community? What is affecting your friends and family members who are LGBTQ? And how can we address those issues? We work in collaboration with the community. We work in collaboration with grassroots organizations. So it's not just the legislature and the executive. We advise them on what it is that they should be paying attention to, but we gather that information directly from our community. So in that sense, as the mission said, right, we are the conduit, we are the intercessors, if you will, coming from the religious world, right? We are the intermediaries between the system of government and the people. A couple of things that is important for people to understand is that the commission doesn't offer trainings. We do not offer direct services. So if you're looking for a training because your agency or your local government or your church or your club, your social club, you're looking to expand, to understand, to attend the needs of a particular community, in this case, the LGBTQ community. We do not offer that. However, you can reach out to us and we will let you know what resources exist within your county or the next county over, and put you in contact with them so you can check with them and see if that is what you are looking for. And at the same time, if you have complaints or concerns because you have been mistreated or discriminated against, we do not directly work on those cases. That would be the Human Rights Commission. However, if you don't know where to start, if you don't know where to go because you just experienced a discrimination in your doctor's office or with your teacher or in whatever setting, you can reach out to us and we will help you figure out, and map out what is the process that you have to follow. And we will be with you through the process to make sure that you get the services and the support that you need. So, so in that sense, we don't offer, direct services, but we do have the tools and the resources to help you figure out where to get those direct services. And certainly if your rights have been violated, if your rights have been trampled with, do contact us because we want to know what is happening with our community and we want to make sure that we address those issues.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And actually, probably the first question should have been, let's unpack the letters, right? LGBTQ. And I think that, and not to date myself, but when early on in my recollection anyway, you might have had lesbian and gay, or L and G, and maybe bisexual and or transgender. I mean, a lot of that was kind of coalescing in, I would say, the early mid 90s.
Mm-hmm.
But it has continued to kind of grow and morph as we go from just a sexual orientation type of construct to maybe looking at sexual identity and sort of the fluidity of that. So can you help us unpack the letters a little bit? And I think we have a good graphic for that as well.
Yes. So it is always evolving, as you said, Rob. It is always, something new. And people sometimes get frustrated. I recognize that, right? As you said, depending on your age, your social context, even your language, right? Letters mean something different. And the letters of the LGBTQ community mean something different depending on some context. So if we have the slide here, if we can share that. And it looks overwhelming. These are not all of the letters. And I really don't have the time to go through all of them and explain in detail, but I do want to talk a little bit about them. One thing that is important to understand, because we get this question, the LGBTQ community gets this question all the time. Why do you keep adding letters? Well, it's not that we keep adding letters. Is that we keep recognizing that experiences have existed that didn't have a name, that were not named, right? And then as soon as we have a name for that, we want to honor that. Think about, how my own community, the Latino community, has identified throughout the years. We have different experiences that describe the Latino experience in the context of the United States with different words. Just like you, Rob, I spent most of my time in the mainland on the East Coast, right? And there, I don't know if you remember, it's always Hispanic. Whereas in the West Coast is Latino, and now sometimes Latinx. So we're not exploring different things or expressing different things necessarily. We're expanding the understanding of these communities. So it is very important that people understand that it's not willy-nilly that we add letters. We add letters to describe a reality that's always been there, but wasn't named before. So we know that some people are attracted to the people of the same gender expression, of the same sex. So for those people, if they are men we call them gay. If they're women, we call them lesbians. Some people are attracted to both the binary of gender, right? So to femininity and masculinity, and those people are bisexual. So that's the B. Some people have an experience of being transgender, and transgender just means to transcend gender. So the gender that they were assigned when the doctor saw their bodies and couldn't do any, like DNA test or anything like that, because there's a lot of genes and genetics that go behind, what is sex and gender and whatnot, and that's a whole different thing. But some people don't match their experience as a human being with what the doctor assigned them when they were born. And for those people, we have an umbrella term in the community that is transgender, right? So people who transcend the gender binary, and that's an umbrella term. Within the transgender community, then we have other gender expressions like non-binary, who don't live by the binary of gender according to our understanding of gender and what gender is and whatnot. So different experiences have been added, different letters, if you will, have been added to describe experiences that have always been there. So I already talked, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and then there's a bunch of other ones, right? So queer is, again, an umbrella term to talk about the experience. Is a reclamation, reclaiming a concept that was used against us. Now, for those of you who are not within the LGBTQ community or who are not allies, it's very important that you understand that the queer word, the concept of queer, belongs to us. So don't go out there, willy-nilly using that word, because that's a word that we as a community have reclaimed and is very special. We have regained power and presence through reclaiming that word. So although you can use the LGBTQ, the LGBTQ letters, be careful on how you use the actual words, depending on how the person identifies and your proximity to the work with the community. So the queer is a difficult word for people outside of the community to use. So be careful with that. And then we have people who are still questioning who they are, right? We continue growing through life, and sometimes we learn things about ourselves. So, and sometimes you might fall in love with a person of the same sex later in life, and you never had that feeling before. So the question is, to encompass that and whatnot. E in Spanish, but I in English, intersex is the experience of people who are born both genetically and physiologically with both male, or traditionally understood as male and female, genitalia or genes or physiology. Right, so that's an intersex person. There was a word that was used before that starts with an H that I'm not going to use. That word has been discontinued. It was a medical terminology. It's not a good thing to use anymore. So we use intersex. And then A for ally, A for asexual, people who don't feel any sexual attraction of any kind or very little sexual attraction. P for pansexual, which means that people who are attracted both mentally, emotionally, psychologically, sexually, attracted to people of all genders and gender expressions and sexualities. That's a person who is a pansexual, of pansexual experience. And the difference between pansexual and bisexual is that bisexual looks at the binary of gender and how it's expressed. Pansexual is a person who's attracted to the whole spectrum of gender, regardless of how they identify themselves. So that's very quickly, but there's a bunch of agencies that actually have whole trainings on each one of these identities and their experience and their history and why. And obviously, these are just a few of the letters that express our communities. Now, for the government, right now, what we are using as a standard is LGBTQ. Some people add the plus sign to recognize more people. Another identity that I want to recognize is Two-Spirit, which is from the experience of indigenous folk who had that experience of gender and sexuality that didn't fit into the male and female categories, and they've always been here. So yeah, as we learn more about human sexuality and we name those experiences, more letters are added, but you can use LGBTQ for short.
Okay, well, thank you for that. But I think it was a great starting point of truly trying to unpack it and make sure that everyone kind of understands the fluidity of I'll call it a spectrum, really, of life. But you also mentioned sort of the ownership of the word queer for the LGBTQ community. And I think it just makes me think about a couple sessions ago, we were talking about microaggressions. And it's sort of the use of queer, or when I was growing up, it was really kind of the use of gay, and being a very derogatory term. It's just sort of that really kind of I don't know, a jab or whatever. It's just that assault on some level is really kind of that challenge. Can you speak a little bit about that in terms of maybe where we've come from, your experience and what you've seen over the years of just sort of how that reclamation of the term makes it, and really, I mean, for the folks that maybe have not thought about the impact of the use of those terms, what they can do to kind of, maybe have a different perspective and understanding of the impact that the use of that word has. And
yeah, so I think that you pointed something very important. You pointed out something very important, and it's the impact that our speech is going to have on other people, right? So we all make assumptions about who the other person is based on our first impression of what we see. Now, what we see is always through the lens of through the lens that we were taught how to read things, right? Like I have this lens and I can see you better actually because these are kind of new, right? But if I had different lenses, and I have like a pair of sunglasses, I see the same things, but I see it in a different shade, right? Because the sunglasses have something different, something added, something that was added. So it's the same thing that happens with the words that we use to describe our experiences. It used to be that, we only had the one word, gay, or homosexual was the word, right? It was a clinical definition. It is still very clinical, so that's why we prefer not to be called homosexual. That's a very clinical term, so much so that it comes with the baggage of every other clinical word that we have, or technology word that we have, which is a compound of Greek and Latin and whatever it is. So every word has a story, right, with it. And it's the same with the word queer. It was used in a way, still is used in a way that is derogatory in English. I also have to say, and you have already noticed this from my bio and my accent, I didn't grow up speaking English. So I only know of this word as a young adult exposed to it and as an activist. But the word queer in the context of the United States has a long history of being used in a derogatory manner. And we have to acknowledge that. Now, some communities have reclaimed the word because it gives us power. Instead of letting you name me, I am going to take my experience and name it myself. So if you use this word to insult me, I'm going to take that power from you. I'm going to say, what? I don't care what you call me because I am this. And that's what's happened with the word queer. Now, that doesn't mean that every single LGBTQ individual feels the same. And that's why it's so important to not get caught on the lens that we wear to read the other person, and instead use our interaction with each other to learn more about each other. So never assume that because in your mind, your society, your context has taught you that this person, because this person has these characteristics, oh, immediately, oh, that person is very feminine, but he looks male, so he must be gay. Never make that assumption. When you build a relationship with that person, whether it's professional or personal, in that relationship building, you will find the time where you can share with each other and then ask, how do you identify? Who is your family, right? And don't make the assumption. And don't make the assumption that they feel comfortable using the word queer or any of the other words for that matter, right? We do have some people of certain generations for whom the word queer in particular was a traumatizing experience. Being called queer was so traumatizing. It was so attached to the hatred that they had to survive that they don't feel comfortable identifying as such, right? And we have to recognize that. We have to um, acknowledge that and honor that, because by the way, their survival and the fact that they survived that violence, that is what made us be here safe, right? So we have to honor that. So when it comes to the use of words, the most important thing is ask the person how they identify. Don't assume that because this is the catchy new phrase that we use, that's how that person is going to be identifying us. Always ask. Never ask before a relationship is not built, right? Like, wait until the relationship is built. And remember that at the end of the day, if you're interacting with someone, you don't need to know more than what you need to accomplish whatever it is that you have to accomplish in that interaction, right? Like, so why are we always so curious about other people's identities? You don't have to know that. I always made the jokes that for us Puerto Ricans, we will tell you that we're Puerto Rican within the first 5 seconds of meeting you. It's something that you're gonna say. It's the same with many LGBTQ folks. They will share that with you if they feel comfortable. Never assume. Always ask when it's appropriate. And if you don't have to ask, then don't ask. And remember that every one of these words and these categories has a history behind them, and that they fluctuate as well, right? Like, they are not always. You might not always identify in the same way. So yeah, that
So
was a long answer to that, but I
no,
love linguistics.
I appreciate that, but I'll take it a little bit of a nuance. You talk about don't ask until you've built that relationship, but there's also, I think, an element for probably anyone that you're constantly, one of those processes that can kind of wear you down, just like those microaggressions, is that you are constantly having to out yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I use that phrase that is kind of was the term of art when I was growing up. But it's like every time you have that interaction, and I think about my experience in Rotary, it's just sort of like every time you have to kind of redefine who you are and share that, and so you're just kind of like opening yourself up one more time, and sometimes it could be because of the if maybe it's a joke or something that someone said, or just the assumption. It's like, okay, you look like a nice guy, I can fix you up with my granddaughter, and it's just those, they can kind of wear you down. Is there something or advice that you could give folks that are listening to this to say, okay, step back, again, don't ask until, or don't assume, or how do you phrase something so that you don't put someone in that awkward position of having to rip that band-aid off again and share who they, especially if they're not ready to do that.
Yeah, I think that there are many tools that we can use, right, with each other. I also want to say that it is true. What you have said is absolutely true. Like, we have to out ourselves every time that we go to a doctor. Who's your emergency contact? And you have to say, my husband or whatever. And that's you have to out yourself. We also cannot assume that the other person understands the nuance of life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the many identities that we embody as individuals, right? So one thing that I always say is, excuse me, that one of the great things about the English language is that, contrary to Spanish, where everything is gendered, English has a lot of neutral words for gender neutral words for a whole lot of things. So for instance, whereas in Spanish you have to actually adapt the gender of spouse, you have to, there's no neutral spouse name or word to describe that relationship. In English, you do have spouse, right? So, for instance, if you have to ask about a spouse, use that word. Don't assume that the person has a spouse of a specific gender or sex, and that tiny little thing is going to be the key to a person who is of a different sexual orientation than heterosexual, is a key to say, oh, this is a safe person for me to share this information. So it doesn't feel like I'm being outed or that I have to force myself to out myself, because the person is already providing the safe place to recognize that heterosexuality is not the only reality of relationships, right? I remember at Rainbow Center, we had a staff person who did trainings, and they always shared the experience of how when a friend of them went to a mattress store, the salesperson said, instead of saying your partner, or said your sleeping companion. And it's like, I mean, first of all, it sounds poetic.
Yeah.
But it's also like, oh, they didn't assume that I had, a female partner. It was a person who identified as a man, so, or male. So they didn't assume that it was a wife. It's like a gender neutral concept. Someone you're gonna use this for sleeping with someone else. So sure, sleeping companion. So there are times when we can use gender neutral language to convey the reality that this interaction is a safe interaction for us, so you don't have to out yourself, because I'm not going to make the assumption that you are this or that. The other thing, I said this jokingly, but I always assume that everybody's gay until they tell me otherwise. Like if I had to grow up with the same thing on the other side, I'm going to do it. But that's a joke, by the way. But so there are things like that you can do. The other thing is, there are contexts for questions, right? If your job requires you to make a question about someone's partner or sexuality or health, be clear that that's the reason why you're asking that question. Don't assume that because this person came to you and you work at a reception at a hospital, that they understand that they have to ask these questions. I mean, that they have to answer these questions about their genitalia or their gender identity. No, always make the person feel like they are welcome there, regardless of what answer they're going to give you to that question. So for instance, if I go to the hospital and the person at the front desk, instead of just assuming that I'm gonna mark male on my sex, just ask, and frame that question by saying, we recognize that there are many genders and gender expressions. I need to match the information here with what is on your insurance card. Can you give me this information? That makes the person understand that this is a safe interaction. I don't have to out myself. I'm going to share with you because you need that information, and it doesn't make me feel uncomfortable that I have to share this information. So always try to make the interaction as safe as possible without assuming, without being too intrusive. If you have to ask the question because is of a medical reason or educational reason or whatever it is, always frame it, letting the person understand that I'm asking this question because it's required and it needs to match this or whatnot. And do it in a way that makes the other person comfortable. So don't make it threatening, obviously, right? So there are things like that you can do to move a microaggression to be actually something that could be a microaggression, right? Like assuming your partner's sex or gender. It can be actually, the same interaction can be easily converted into a safe interaction because I am giving you the cue that this interaction is safe, that I understand that sexuality is diverse, that it has nuance, that is not just my experience, the one that defines everything else, that there's a bunch of other things. And guess what? Because this is one thing that people have as a counter argument. The people who are not going to get it are not going to get it. And they still are going to answer the question, because the question at the end of the day, they have answered all the time. So if a person is in a heterosexual relationship, they don't understand about gay relationships or lesbian relationships or whatnot, they're still going to answer the question, and they are not gonna understand the nuance, of creating that safe space, because they're used to that. So, your spouse is your spouse, and you immediately go to, oh yeah, my female spouse, because I'm man. So they're never going to catch that key, right, on the interaction. So you don't lose anything by creating the safe space, because the people who are not having the experience of having to out themselves all the time are not going to get it. They don't need to, and it's fine. So the interaction is going to be fine and affirming. And the person who understands it, because they do live outside of what the society says that is the norm, they're gonna get it and really like honor that. So
switching gears just a little bit, it kind of gets back to something that you said earlier. I think on some level, gender diversity is almost a hidden trait. You cannot, like you said, you cannot make assumptions just by looking at someone as to where they are necessarily. And so that kind of gets me to thinking about sort of this whole gender diversity and intersectionality of sort of, we are not just what one sees and makes those assumptions, but we are so nuanced to be, our ethnic background, our genetic background, and also, by the way, we happen to have this gender diversity as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
About intersectionality or gender in specific? Which one?
well, the intersectionality, really, I think of gender diversity and ethnicity, maybe. That is something that I believe from your bio that is probably something that has crossed your path before. Can you talk a little bit
All
about
the time.
that? Yeah.
All the time. So I'm gonna phrase this or frame this by saying that all of us have identities, right? All of us. We often talk about the relationship between the majority and oppressed communities, and that's important. But that doesn't mean that the majority doesn't have identity and doesn't have intersectionality in their identity. Our privilege and our oppression is, to some extent, not always, but to some extent, contextual, right? I do have some privilege as a cisgender man who speaks the language and who was born in a colony of the United States that by default has access to US citizenship, right? So that puts me in an advantage over my husband, who was born, who for this context and this society is the same, right? Because, oh, another Latino, when in reality, he is an indigenous person who is discriminated against in his own country because of anti-indigenous realities that exist in Mexico. And then when he moved here, the whole issue about access, to the same privileges that people with citizenship have. So it's always contextual. Our privilege is not always, but most of the time contextual, right? So with that, I want to show the slide on intersectionality. These are just a few a few of the things that we mean when we say intersectionality, right? So certainly here I picked the one that had sexual orientation at the center because we were talking about that, but you can put whatever at the center, right? Whatever is how you identify first at the center. And in this context, and that is also contextual, by the way, because you might identify first with your race, first with your ethnicity or your place of origin or your language, or it depends on what the interaction is. But the truth is that we all have all of these, and that doesn't, it doesn't change. You are who you are. As Jamie, shared during the introduction, I come from the theological world, so I'm from the Christian perspective. So in most Christian experiences or most Christian theologies, we talk about the incarnation, right? Like God became human, and that's why I love talking about the embodiment or the enfleshment, which is, by the way, what Paul talked about when he wrote about incarnation, enfleshment. The enfleshment and the embodiment of who we are. We are many things at once, and not one of them is more important than the other. Some of these identities change over time. For instance, because people always get caught on, oh well, but that person identified as gay and now they say that they're bisexual. Why? Or that person was a lesbian and now he said that he's a trans man. How can they change so willy-nilly? Well, think about this. Many people are born without any disability, and throughout life they can become disabled. That doesn't make them less of who they are. That just expands who they are, right? And our whole lives we are adapting and adopting identities according to the context in which we are. So going back to these bubbles and all that, we are all of these, and all of these, most of these things change and swift and move. Think about nationality, for instance. Again, using my husband's experience, his nationality was Mexican by birth, sure. Now he holds a U.S. passport. So when he answers this question for legal matters, his nationality is USA, right? It changed, and people don't think about that. People get caught up on the sexuality part, right? Because it's such a taboo. But as you heard, I love talking about religion and sex and politics, so I'm gonna talk about these things. Our language, we acquire new languages or we lose some of our language. Our political affiliation, it changes over time. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we grow out of one thing and adopt another thing. So we have to think about all of who we are and not get caught up on the one thing that the other person noticed first, right? I am not just a gay person. I'm a Latino person. I'm a Latino person living in the United States. I'm a Latino person from a colony of the United States. That makes it different than a person who comes here from a country that is, that's always been independent. Or there's so many nuance to all of this reality, even for yourself, right? Like you represent, generally speaking, the majority of the United States and what we consider the majority. But how many other things, how many other realities, how many other parts of who you are left out when we only focus on that one thing, right? Um, and we cannot make assumption about any of that about anyone. So always think about intersectionality as something that we all have. We are all of these at once, and not one of them, not one of these realities is better than the other or fighting against each other. We are all of these at the same time, and we should celebrate that. And once that we understand that, then we can start thinking about where can I connect with this person, because there must be something here that we connect with in this wonderful, selection of identities. There must be something here that we can connect on, and if nothing else, we're human. That's the one identity that we all have in common, right? So yeah, intersectionality is who we are. At the core of it is the expression of our humanity, and it covers all of who we are. We all have some intersectionality.
So question, I think it's really we talk about sort of the intersectionality. We are our ethnicity, we are our gender, we're our gender expression, the diversity. Can you talk a little bit about, to the extent that you have knowledge of it, is really kind of this cultural diversity and the acceptance of gender based on that culture? Whether, you talked about the two spirits within the indigenous communities and the Latino community, Black, Pacific Islander. it seems like, from my experience anyway, and sort of seeing how LGBTQ individuals were accepted or not within their respective communities, it seems like there can also in some way be this layering of oppression, or a layering of some type of lack of acceptance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's actually a function of our intersectionality, right? Because oftentimes, as I said earlier, I am a cisgender man. Cisgender meaning that I conform with the society's understanding of what a man should be. So I enjoy wearing pants. I enjoy wearing shirts. I enjoy what society says, that I should do as a man. I enjoy that and feel comfortable. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing better about that. Unfortunately, society has given me more privilege because of that, conforming to those standards, than to people who don't, or people who are on the opposite spectrum of that standard. Being man gives you more privilege than being a woman in this context, in this society. But it's not the same in other contexts and other societies. I do know of societies outside of the United States in this case, where that are matrilineal and matriarchal. So where a woman is it has more power in the structures of society, and that's on how that society works, than what we have here in the United States today. So it's a different way of approaching, right? Like this intersectionality of who we are in terms of our sex and gender. So in the context of the United States, because of the history of the United States, there is a particular way of relating to different people based on different parts of who they are. And in this case, because of historical context, because of historical things, people who are of Latino descent, like myself, have to navigate systems that were not created for us, that don't necessarily take into consideration who we are and the reality that we bring with ourselves. And the same thing with sexuality. Most of the systems that have been created in Western societies are based on the binary of gender and sex, only men and only women. Excuse me. So when we go out to the world to interact as our full selves, sometimes it's complicated to navigate, okay, what part of myself, what part of my full self I have to highlight here to either get ahead on something, because this other part is not going to allow me to, to go too far, or not that part, but because that system is not going to allow this part of myself to get ahead. And what do I have to play down? What do I have to highlight and whatnot? So going back to the original question about intersectionality and how different cultures approach this. I'm sorry, my chair kind of slipped. But different cultures have had different approach to sexuality and sex. As we mentioned earlier, yes, the two-spirit reality is an umbrella term for gender and sexual expressions that existed in the Americas before our ancestors from Spain came here, right? And I say our ancestors because look at this. My ancestors come from the same region as the majority white American ancestors, but it's not recognized because of my more recent origins in the Caribbean, right? So all these intersections and stories that we bring with ourselves is so interesting to see how they interact with the world, right? And oftentimes, whatever our own culture deems more important, that's what we want the next generation to highlight and to bring. So if we see something that is different, we're going to be suspicious. I want to say something here that gets me in trouble with progressive voices. So bear with me. And that doesn't mean that I dismiss them. I'm with them. But here's the thing. I believe that we are not intentionally wanting to oppress other folk. we are, as human beings, scared of what is different. And therefore, we're going to express that scary feeling through actions that are going to hurt the other person. And that's where I go back to, progressive voices and say, yeah, that's wrong. But I want to acknowledge that the reason why we have so much discrimination and so much oppression is because we haven't been able to work through the fear that we have of what is different. And the only thing that we know is whatever our context taught us is safe. So one of the reasons why we talk about sex, where we talk about sexuality, why we talk about LGBTQ issues, is to make it normal, to make people feel less afraid of something that's always been there, that has just recently been named, and to let you know we've always been here. You don't have to be afraid of us, just like you don't have to be afraid of whatever else we bring with ourselves, right? Um, Think about the relationship between people of European descent who were Scottish or Irish or Italian in comparison to German and English folk, right? um, well, some of them had to become white. There's actually a whole book, Becoming White. And we have to think about those things, right? Like, we have to start talking about those things that we fear, so we don't fear them anymore. Because I know that people are not oppressing me because they want. They just don't know how to interact with me as this, Arab looking Latino with an accent who happens to be gay. Like, I know, I get it. But once that you get to know me, you will know that the one intersection that we have in common is that we are human, that have different experiences. So it's important to recognize that, and it's important to give grace to everybody, um, not to be down, obviously, but to be proud of who we are, and to recognize that whenever I bring something that is different, is going to make the other person uncomfortable, and that's okay. To work through that discomfort to get to the place where we can interact as human beings.
So, Manny, in the time that we have left, I just want to go back to our alphabet that we had before, and that's kind of pulling out on the A, and that's for ally. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the things that, as we talk about the intersectionality, we talk about sort of the complexity and understanding, and we kind of touched on it a little bit before about how people can kind of create that safe space. But what is it that someone who is an ally, that it is wants to understand, wants to create that space that is welcoming and supportive, um, nurturing for the LGBT community? What is it that they need to would be helpful to understand or to learn? How can they help? How can like that example of trying to create that space in while checking in at the doctor's office, where they don't have to, it can be a safe space, it can be felt as safe space. Are there other examples or suggestions that you can make?
Yeah, a lot, but
Yeah.
but a few things that I think are important is, first of all, recognize your own fears, right? Recognize what it is that makes you uncomfortable about engaging in these conversations. Is it because you were taught like that? Is it because your religious communities taught you like that? Is it because you had a difficult experience growing up with people who were different than you? Think about that, because those experiences, those realities were very contextual. They happen in a particular time and place and all that. So you have to kind of take the risk of moving away from that and recognize that that's your issue, my issue, right? And not the community's issue. So to work through that, be self-conscious about what it is that makes you uncomfortable, how you deal with that discomfort. So once that you are ready to recognize that, is going to be way easier to actually go, further and do more and be actually active be an active ally. Something very important is that ally is a title that is given to anyone by the community that you are aligned with, or that you are building the alliance with. So I often say that I'm a feminist, but not really. I am a person who learns and continues to learn about feminism and wants to be a better ally to my women friends and colleagues. So some of them have called me feminist, and I enjoy that and like it, but I'm not gonna call myself that out of the box because it's not my allyship to name. It is theirs to,
To give.
to give me. Yeah.
Hmm.
And it's the same with a person who's an ally of the LGBTQ community. it, allyship has many stages, right? You can be in the first stages and just learning, and with that learn, read, don't use your gay friend as the teacher, go outside of that, and learn as much as you can, build the relationship with the people that you want to know more, instead of just assuming or building the relationship because you want to know more. Don't do that. Don't become a friend with a Latino person because you want to learn Spanish. That's not how it works. It's the same in other contexts, right? So allow the community to name you as an ally. Don't say I'm an ally. Say I'm in the journey of becoming an ally. I want to be an ally, even if you think that you know it all, because we never know it all. I don't know it all. So think about those things, right? And the nuance of those interactions. There is a there was an image that I had in my mind of a movie. Yeah, 50-50. It was a movie filmed here in Seattle, where a young man gets a brain tumor and a cancer, and his best friend is like treating him really bad. He didn't change the way that he treated him, right? His best friend didn't. And then one day when the person who is the patient is very frustrated and he's visiting his friend, and then he finds in his friend's bathroom all these books about cancer. Now the guy never once asked him about cancer. He learned on his own about that so he could be a better friend. And one of the suggestions that he had highlighted in one of those books was, do not change the way that you treat your best friend. And he didn't. So he kept being the same, like guy that pissed off his friend all the time, because he wanted to show him that he was there for him. But he was learning about his friend's diagnosis, what he might have need in the future, everything. But he never actually went to his friend and said, hey, I'm such a good ally of a cancer patient because I'm doing this. No, he kept doing he kept being a friend and learning. So that's the same thing for the rest of us who are in the journey of being an ally to any other oppressed community. Be there, learn, and and just show up.
So, what would you say for Jillian, where there is sometimes can be that fear that kind of paralyzes someone from kind of moving forward because they don't want to say or do the wrong thing. Is there How do you kind of create that space in the other direction to
Yeah.
be supportive so they can engage?
Be honest. Be honest when you ask the question. I have a question to ask you as my friend, and I don't know if this is offensive or not. If the person says, I don't want to hear that, or I am not in a point where I can help you with that, respect that, and know that the person is not mad at you. They're just not ready to address that. So try to go to another, a professional. There's something that many, especially people who do anti-racism work, say to everyone all the time, and is that just because I experience or I live my life in this body and in this reality doesn't mean that I am your teacher. And that's true. And at the same time, some of us do enjoy that. So if your friend is not ready to address that, and by the way, not every friend, just because they're gay, are going to be able to tell you everything about the LGBTQ community, right? They just want to live their lives. That's it. So recognize that if they are not ready or don't have the tools to address your concern and you're afraid that you might hurt them, remember that they're professionals who do get these questions all the time, and we are not going to be offended. So if you need to go to a professional and say, you know what, I have a friend that I want to interact with and they're trans and I'm afraid that I'm going to offend them if I ask them these questions, I'm coming to you. I'm going to pay for your time because this is what you do professionally. Help me figure this out. And then go back and have interactions with your friend. The other thing that I want to highlight here too is that sometimes we have to think about what is the question and why is it that we feel that we are going to offend? Is it because we want to know way too much about that person's story? Right? It is not my right or anybody's right to ask about other person's private, things and private actions. You don't go around asking your single, twice married, twice divorced friends, how many people they have slept with or whatever it is. You don't do that. Sometimes if the relationship is good, they share with you. That's fine. So treat your LGBTQ friends just like you treat everybody else. If you're not going to ask this question to a straight friend, there's no reason to ask it to a gay friend.
So another question I would say is, and I don't want it folks that are watching this to say it's sort of LGBTQ and everybody else, right? There's this whole nuance within the LGBTQ community where we all because of our lived experience, we bring our own biases to it. We know and understand hopefully ourselves, but we may not understand that person who is trans, and so we have this dynamic that we have within our own community, the broader community, as anyone else would. So any tricks for folks that are part of or a community member of how they can be a better community member, better ally within the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, I think that first of all, to learn our history as a community, one of the things that happened with the LGBTQ community is that for the most part, especially before modern times, we didn't have the opportunity to have kids, right? And to have the next generation to teach and even today, even if a gay couple has kids, they might not identify as LGBTQ, the kids. And actually that's usually the case. So we have to learn how to navigate the world as LGBTQ people through history. So learn our history, learn who came before us, learn who were the people who opened doors for us so we could be here today, because that helps in contextualizing many of these conversations, right? Yes, I do not know everything about the trans experience because I'm not trans, and I will never know. So the other thing that we have to acknowledge as humans is that we're not gonna know everything. So it is okay to be with a little bit of gaps in our knowledge. It is okay. Feel comfortable with that. Remember that you don't know everything that has to be known about your friends, even if they're your best friends. So try to be comfortable with that. I think that that'll help in lower the anxiety of, oh my God, am I saying the wrong thing or am I doing the wrong thing? Well, yeah, maybe. And if you don't make a big deal out of it, nobody's going to notice, right? So things like that. Even though I encourage people to learn more and to interact with the community and whatnot, also, like, don't make it a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
If you make a mistake, apologize and move on. You have made tons of mistakes before. Your friend who was pregnant that lost a baby, and you probably mentioned the baby without knowing that they had lost their baby, and you feel awful, and the person probably felt awful too, but because you have a relationship, you ask for forgiveness, move on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's hurtful. It is hurtful. So it's going to be hurtful sometimes, and if you have built that relationship, you can actually move on. Just recognize that you made a mistake and then continue. There's a question here with pronouns.
Well, yeah, that's Dan has the question about the pronouns are fairly new for a lot of folks, and how they work and may be able to support people in the LGBT community.
And this is actually great for allyship, right? It is a great way of showing allyship and the desire to be an ally. Now, I do have to burst your bubble. Pronouns are not new. And I think, when I said something about earlier about, like, recognize that we've always had these interactions, we've always done this with our straight friends. It's just that now it's scary because we're doing it, the same interaction with the LGBTQ community. But we have used pronouns as long as we've had language. So when people say, "Oh my God, all this is new," no, it's not. We have always used pronouns. They are part of of the languages that I'm aware of and that I understand. They have always been there. So I think that the fear is that we are being asked by society to adapt the way in which we use a tool that has been part of the English language for as long as English has been a language, right? That's the fear. So the first step is, again, to recognize that pronouns are not new. We've always used pronouns. It's just that before, we use the lens that we've had to make an assumption about a person's pronouns. So, him, his, she, hers, they, them, it's those four pronouns have always been part of the English language. As soon, well, some of them were changed, thee and thy, that, but pronouns have always been part of the English language, right? So recognize that. Once that you recognize that, you're like, oh, this is not new. I can navigate this. The other part is, excuse me, it can be confusing, especially when you have been taught since you were a kid, and especially for those of us who learn English as a second language or third or fourth, that there are these rules that you have to follow about pronouns. So you have single pronouns and gender neutral pronouns, and plural pronouns, right? But guess what? I mean, we work with breaks to the rules all the time. All the time. So it only becomes a problem, quote unquote, when it's in this context of individuals. But what I want to point out is that the fear comes because we don't know how to navigate it, not because these things are new, right? So we're seeing it as new because we fear it. But when you start thinking about this as always been there, pronouns have always been there, and we have always used plural pronouns to refer to singular items or individuals. For instance, oh, someone, singular, left their umbrella, plural, right? You don't say, well, sometimes you say he forgot his umbrella, but usually if you don't know the sex or the gender of the person who left the umbrella, in English, the most common expression is, oh, someone left their umbrella. We have been using the plural, quote unquote, plural pronoun forever, and now it's scary because we don't know how to use it. No, you've always known it. You've always known it as both plural and, in breaking the rule, in singular, according to the context of the sentence. So, and the context of what happened. So it's the same thing that people are asking us. I use any pronouns, by the way. I feel comfortable with any pronouns. The pronouns that you use for me are not going to define who I am. They're just going to refer to me when you need to refer to me and not want to use my name over and over and over again. So feel free to use anyone. A great way of creating a space that is safe for other people to share their pronouns is, in your signature, for instance, or as we are doing here, you have your pronouns on your title here. I have mine here. That gives the cue to the person that is interacting with you if they use a different pronoun than the one that you will assign to them based on the lens that you're reading them through. But that is going to signal to them that this is a safe space for me to share with you my pronouns. Also, depending on your job, if you need to ask for pronouns, do ask for them. If the person doesn't understand, they're not understand, move on. If the person recognizes this as a way of creating a safe space, oh my God, I can be honest with you and I can share this information with you. It's going to make all the difference. And remember that we, especially in the United States, where we pay so much attention to freedom and liberty and life, right? We have to create that for the other. It's not just about me, it's about the other as well, right? About the society which we live. So if I create the space for the other person to feel comfortable to share their pronouns with me, I'm doing great. I'm offering them the freedom that they deserve to have to share with me that information. The other thing is that oftentimes some people suggest to directly ask for pronouns. I personally don't feel like it. I don't feel like that's the best way. Maybe it's contextual. I will not go too much into that, but I usually do acknowledge the diversity of pronouns by introducing myself and sharing the fact that I use any pronouns. If the other person wants to share with me, fine. If not, that's fine too. And if you miss a pronoun, if the person says, hey, I'm so and so and I use these pronouns, use them. When you fail, acknowledge that you failed, recognize it, apologize and move on. Don't delve there, because that's not what growth is. Growth is recognizing the error, amending, and moving on.
Mm-hmm. Don't let fear be the impediment for moving forward.
No.
Or the fear of failure.
Yeah.
So Manny, there's got to be something that you would like to share with our viewers today that I did not ask you about. Well, within reason. There's always something. This is a very broad topic. We've covered a lot of different things in terms of really defining what the LGBTQ is and beyond, and sort of the diversity, intersectionality, which drives all of our lives in so many different ways. What have I missed? What is it that you want to make sure that everybody hears?
Not that you miss anything. I think that we covered pretty much all of the big, broad things. I think that, excuse me, fear is what is keeping us from moving forward on these issues. We don't want to make the LGBTQ conversation a taboo, right? Recognize that this is another topic to talk about. It should be a casual topic to talk about, my gay friends, my trans friends, and what is happening. That is one of the first steps for allyship, to recognize that we are part of the society, and every society, regardless of what different governments say about us, right? Regardless of what the law might say, or your faith, or whatever. We are part of the society. It doesn't matter if you personally oppose to one or two things. We are living in this society together, and respect for each other and recognition that we are different is key to move forward. I'm not asking you, and I don't mean you, Rob, because I know that you, but I'm not asking, the plural you. I'm not asking, society to come on board and be just like me. No, I'm asking you to recognize that I am who I am, that I am different than you, and that I share many experiences with you. That's all that we are all asking for. And once that we recognize that, we can have a conversation about anything and everything, and be okay with it, because it's just recognizing that we have different experiences, that I honor that, and that I don't have to become like you in order to recognize that you have a space in this society as well. So
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And one other thought that I know may take us down another rabbit hole, but I not too recently, I finished the Isabel Wilkerson book, Cast, and it really for me was a very, it was mind blowing in many ways, and just helping to kind of reframe. But then I was thinking about that in sort of an iterative process. It's not just sort of the dominant caste and subordinate caste, but even within each one of those castes, there are so many different layers, and it kind of makes me think, go back, not to beat the intersectionality piece to death, but it's sort of like there are just so many nuances, just as much as there are genetic differences that make up our features and our eye color, hair color, etc. it's just, there are so many different nuances, and often for me, it's that understanding that, like you said, it's that fear of the unknown, the fear of something different, the fear of securing what my bubble is. I want to maintain that bubble, and so there's this concern that somehow I threaten my own existence by understanding that other person and the nuances, and really accept them for all of the intersectionality that they are, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's at the core, right? Like, we fear what we don't know, but once that we know it, we are gonna lose every fear and interact with it, regardless of whether or not we want to become that, or we think that we're gonna be too close to what that we fear is. That's not the point. The point is not to recruit anyone. The point is to share who we are with one another, and to dispel any fear that exists in having that interaction.
Yep, great, appreciate it. Jamie, is there anything that we missed?
I don't think so. I think we had a very robust conversation, but I think we could probably go on for another hour or so.
I'm still a Baptist preacher, that's why.
We promised Manny to get him back to his husband at a reasonable hour today. So we will go ahead and call it a wrap for today's discussion. It has been just such a great conversation. I think has given people a lot to think about. And again, those little things that we can change that make big impacts in positive ways. And so I would encourage folks, as Manny mentioned, we got to get beyond our fear and replace our fear with empathy and curiosity, and use that as the bridge for understanding and building allyship. So thank you again, Manny and Rob, for such a great conversation. We will have our next conversation, our fifth one in our series of 6, next Tuesday, June 1st at the same time. We will be diving into dismantling racism. Our Rotarian Dan Whedon will lead the discussion with Dr. Terry McMullen, who's the author of Habits of Whiteness and a professor at Eastern Washington University. So looking forward to another great conversation. And in the meantime, keep up the good work. And thank you all for what you do in our communities and through Rotary.
Thank you.
Great stuff.
Thank you, Manny.
Thank you.